At the age of 41, I was newly divorced, and it so happened about the same time I had finally, over a period of an adult lifetime, had accumulated enough points for a free airplane ticket to Europe. On the advice of several better traveled friends, I made my first European trip as a tourist to see Paris. I was working my way through all of the Michelin tour book recommended things that a tourist really must see, and that's a long list in Paris. I got through all of the 4-star sites, worked my way down into the 2- and 3-star sites, one of which was the tomb of Napoleon Bonaparte. I'd been surprised at several points in my week of being a tourist in Paris by how much oblation was shown to the memory of a man who had frankly not been portrayed in a very favorable light in my public school education. But that only means that my public school education was not in France, ladies and gentlemen. The sarcophagus of Napoleon Bonaparte sits enthroned beneath a dome that is more than 100 yards high, and the tomb itself is so massive that it could have held the remains of 24 men the size of Napoleon. Now, Hitler attempted to militarily conquer the world, but Hitler isn't remembered well even in most of Germany. But Napoleon, who had remarkably similar designs on world domination, has grown larger and larger and larger in the memory of the French than he ever was in real life. Everything about him, his apartments, his furniture, his personal effects, are treated with greater reverence than the remains of a beloved saint. I made a remark in my own diary during my trip to Paris that were the French given a choice between having Jesus return or Napoleon, they would choose Napoleon without hesitation. Without debating the good or the ill aspects of Napoleon's character, he is revered by the French because of what he represents to them, not really for who he was. He represented a time when France was striving to be, and was, briefly, the world power. And a couple of hundred years later, you really wouldn't have to scrape the surface of the collective French ego to find a still surviving belief that if the world had any sense, France would still be ruling the world. People tend to expand the memory of their heroes over time. People in our time will comment on the obvious phallic nature of the Washington Monument, erected in honor of America's first president. It stands 555 feet tall, which, consciously or unconsciously, says something about the remembered stature of the president and the Revolutionary War general, George Washington. And not to be outdone, even after losing the Civil War, survivors saw to the construction of a memorial to the first president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, which is placed near his birthplace in western Kentucky. It goes without saying that the monument to Davis, once it was completed early in the 20th century, that it was dedicated by the Ku Klux Klan burning a cross on top of it. In the ancient world, there were predictable evolutions of historical heroes being enhanced by the generations that followed for their own benefit, until a late king like Gilgamesh of Sumer goes from being a popular king during his lifetime to a person of superhuman strength, like a comic book hero, and finally to being portrayed as a god. While most Buddhists would insist that Buddha was not a god, one need only spend a little time in Thailand to discover that, in spite of the protest, the treatment of Buddha is a classic example of deification. But I have also known some Trappist monks whose veneration of the Virgin Mary, if you're honest about it at all, goes far beyond respect and adoration of a human. Some even call Mary the co-redemptress with Christ. It just doesn't really sound like monotheism if you take them at face value. Deification, however, almost always wipes out the intended message of a religion. To the extent that we can take historical narratives about the Buddha seriously, he was born a prince in India, but he chose to set power, position, and wealth aside in order to be an ascetic monk seeking truth and enlightenment. But over the centuries, Buddha stops being just an ascetic figure and teacher and is more or less, inch by inch, brought back into the palace with power and prestige and position. The most holy Buddhist temple in Thailand is where the jade Buddha statue is kept. You have to take your shoes off just to enter the temple, and attention must be given to how you sit on the floor so that the bottoms of your feet are not within sight of the face of the statue of Buddha. You can't take pictures in there, you can't take videos, and you are expected to be quiet and respectful. And there are a number of guards there to remind you should you forget. The temple is right next to the king's grand palace, so the monk has been brought back to the palace by the king. He left it as a human in history, but over time has literally been brought back in to the palace grounds, surrounded by ornate decoration. And if the point were not clear enough already that this statue is elevated, it's made out of jade, but it also wears clothing, and the clothing has to be changed. So every 6 months, the clothing on the jade Buddha is changed by the king of Thailand, because only the king is allowed to touch this most revered image of the Buddha. It may seem like a humbling task for a king to have to climb up on a ladder and change the clothing on a statue, but come on, if no one can touch it but the king, if it doesn't make the king divine himself, doesn't it make him divine adjacent? And this is how the deification of heroes moves up to being a possession of governments. No matter what you may say about the Buddha's message regarding compassion, rejection of material wealth, power, status, none of that means much in a context in which the Buddha's image is presented in absolute opulence, power, and ultimate status, elevated above the heads of a kneeling crowd. Deification is how we silence a religious message and then turn it over to the government, or possibly even worse, turning it over to organized religion, where it becomes a guardian, not of progress, not of reform or revolution, but of protecting the status quo. Which, it should be obvious by now, is what happened to the historical Jesus. Because trying to describe the historical Jesus is a matter of academic conjecture, it is impossible to come up with an entirely agreed upon description, but using the broadest strokes possible, Jesus was a Jewish reformer during the time of the Roman occupation of Palestine in the 1st century. He was killed by the Roman government because he challenged the authority of Rome. And just a couple of generations after he was crucified, Rome tried to wipe out the Jewish population entirely. They destroyed the Jerusalem temple and the remnants of Judaism, including its branches, and you could call them denominations like Christians and the disciples of John the Baptist, were forced to flee, go into hiding, from which they continued to be rather subversive anti-empire forces. We are now in the thick of the Christmas season, and there are a lot of wonderful things that we can say about Christmas as a cultural event, especially for the more healthy families for whom family gatherings are happy times with feasts and presents and parties. And it's a huge boost to the retail economy. And it usually even gives Wall Street markets a end of the year Santa Claus surprise. Forgive me if I can't be quite as jubilant about the biblical role of the Christmas narrative. I can still remember the day when I was just 19 years old and actively involved in a college campus ministry, one that actually encouraged reading of the Bible, which is something I wanted to do anyway. But even as a kid who was much more inclined to be defensive of all things Christian and not at all at that time a critic of the Bible, even I couldn't help noticing that the two birth narratives in the New Testament, one in Matthew with the star, the wise men, the dreams, and one in Luke with the shepherds and the angels and the stable, that these two stories not only didn't agree with each other, they didn't seem to have anything in common with the Gospels that they were attached to. The language, the vocabulary, the very mythic nature of the birth narratives made me ask my New Testament professor if they were late additions to the Gospels. And I wondered if they might not be more religious imagination than reliable accounts. The students around me at the time were shocked and offended by the question, but they were even more shocked and offended by the professor's response, because even 50 years ago in a conservative Christian college, the professor sighed and acknowledged that the birth narratives were obviously late additions to the gospel, and that they should be read as apologetic sermons, sort of trying to give credence to the story of Jesus, but not actually giving historical accounts of events. The professor ran some professional risk by being so honest, but thankfully he was one of the good ones who believed that telling students the truth was ultimately easier than trying to keep up the scam. You see, the thing is, trying to make a mythic account a literal historical account robs it of the theological point of the narrative. If you tried to take a movie like Star Wars or The Matrix and watch them as if they were historical documentaries, and it's not impossible since the History Channel runs documentaries that give equally fictional pieces about Egyptian history, they run them like documentaries. So it could happen. But sane people know the difference when they're seeing a piece of myth and when they are seeing an actual documentary. The enthusiastic Christians who wrote the birth narratives in Matthew and Luke were, on the face of it, ascribing to Jesus the kinds of things said in their culture about other important figures. Some philosophers, a lot of the royalty, were often said to have had divine parentage, such that they were born to virgin mothers, and sometimes astral signs, a new star or an asteroid, accompanied the birth of a king, or maybe even angels making announcements. So the writers of the Christmas story were, you could say, padding Jesus' resume. But it wasn't just that. They were also writing this fictitious praise of Jesus as a sermon. Luke gives special place to women in his narrative, something that's countercultural for the time. He has the Christ child born into humble circumstances, and the announcement of his birth was made to the lowest and most poor members of society. Matthew maybe even stretches farther, going against Jewish exclusivist prejudices, and has the birth of Jesus announced to foreign astrologers, pagans, rather than to the temple priesthood or to the Jewish king. There are good messages to draw out of the New Testament's birth narratives, just not any history. And in my younger years, when I had to try to find ways to bring modern meaning to ancient myths, and I tried, I really tried when I was a young preacher. I held those midnight lessons and carols services on Christmas Eve with candles and communion. I kept trying to preach demythologizing sermons while still giving some lip service to the traditions of the Christian faith. I even tried to alter the church's traditions a bit. A couple of times we did full-on theatrical productions of Dickens' A Christmas Carol, which really is a Christmas sermon in and of itself about compassion and conversion. Finally, we replaced it with musical presentations of How the Grinch Stole Christmas, which I loved. It was fun, but it still taught a moral lesson without being as heavy-handed as the Christmas Carol or as overtly religious as lessons and carols. Picking hymns for the Advent and Christmas season got harder and harder the more confident we became in a demythologized Christmas. Once you take away the incarnational theology, once you take away the virgin birth view of Christmas, I still remember the day when Sean Spires, my music director, came and sat in my office literally with tears in his eyes, saying, "I just can't sing this Christmas crap anymore." We turned to Christmas albums by Sting and Bruce Cockburn to find more acceptable holiday fare that could be sung with full-throated enthusiasm without all of the little town of Bethlehem or Hark the Herald Angels Sing. I've tried to go a couple of times to traditional Christmas Eve services to hear a good friend's son sing in the college choir or to placate someone's desire for me to accompany them for a holiday event, but at least for me, there's no putting that genie back in the bottle. The virgin birth, incarnational tales of the first century lost their power in the age of reason, and I don't think any of you should feel guilty about just not wanting to participate in it anymore. Enjoy your family gatherings. Indulge yourself in traditional holiday meals. Be generous in gift giving, especially to children and to the poor. And there really is some good holiday music out there that you can enjoy even in a secular context, but you've just got to look for it. I'll leave you with the apologetic that Scrooge's nephew, Fred, offered to him in the Christmas Carol when Scrooge said that Christmas was just humbug, that never put a scrap of gold in your pocket. Fred said to his hard-hearted uncle, "There are many things from which I might have derived good, by which I have not profited. Christmas among the rest. But I am sure I have always thought of Christmas time, when it has come round, as a good time, a kind, forgiving, charitable, pleasant time, the only time I know of in the long calendar of the year when men and women seem by one consent to open their shut-up hearts freely and to think of people below them as if they were really fellow passengers to the grave and not another race of creatures bound on other journeys. And therefore, Uncle, though it has never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe that it has done me good and will do me good, and I say, God bless it." So please, friends, have yourselves a merry, albeit maybe secular, Christmas, and let it do you some good.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.